with the mindfulness. There's a reduction in functional connectivity between the hippocampus and the amygdala in the mindfulness group. So take-home message, childhood maltreatment is associated with marked effects on brain morphology, function, and circuitry. The nature and magnitude of the effect depends to a substantial degree on type of timing of maltreatment during developmental sensitive periods. Sensitive periods detected to date are surprisingly brief and often associated with one or two specific types of maltreatment. Didn't have time to get into it. It's important, though. We've learned from the adverse childhood experience study, we've learned from all of the great work on allostatic load that there's a burden of stress. And so we talk about number of different types of maltreatment that you have being an important risk factor, and you can show a graded relationship between number of types of maltreatment and risk. Turns out that what's more important, number of types of exposure or exposure during a sensitive period? And that it may not be the case that the number of types of experience that you have is the most important determinant. That may be artifactual. It may be the case that the more different exposures you have, the more likely you are to have had a critical experience at a critical age. And same with duration of exposure, same with early onset of exposure. You're more likely in those situations to have been available to have the critical experience. And so we compare in our data those options of exposure during a particular type of maltreatment at a particular age to number of types of maltreatment, severity of maltreatment, and duration. And for most everything, it's exposure during a very narrow critical period that's critical, and not number of types. And that if you do a mediation analysis, it's completely mediated by increasing your risk for having had the critical type. Not everything, dissociation, limbic irritability, a few other things depend on number of types, but hippocampal volume, risk for depression, it's all critical of period. It's assaulted maltreatment associated with alterations in threat detection and response. The different components of these systems have their own unique sensitive period, so you can have widespread vulnerability across development by affecting different components of the circuit. These may be understood as adaptive responses designed to reduce distress and to help individuals reproduce and survive in what appears to be a malevolent world. The impact of maltreatment on trajectories to brain development provides a strong signal that in many instances is much larger than the signal associated with psychopathology per se. It's a huge confound, and studies on the biology of treatment in psychiatric disorders were not taken into account. And that it's really, really critical, I think, to make this distinction. They should be making this distinction in neurobiological studies, making this distinction in genetic studies, and certainly making this distinction in treatment studies. Christine showed how that was important in that refractory depression study. I think it's going to be important in all psychiatric distinction studies as to whether or not the individuals have had a maltreatment history or not. And it's crucial to recognize that early traumatic stress is not just a risk factor for psychopathology. It's a critical element that divides psychiatric disorders in a way that has far-reaching implications for research, treatment, and prevention. Here's my group, and thank you.
Great. Could we have Victor and Mike and Ryan back up here, because we can open it up for questions. And thank you, Marty, for an impressive synthesis of 20 years, at least, of literature, and the important message that for those doing clinical studies in psychiatric disorders, not to assess child maltreatment is to miss an entire picture, and perhaps even an important message to all of NIMH. I got a few chuckles out of that. That's good. All right, so let's open this up to questions for our panel here. Okay, we have the first one over here.
Oh. Hi, thanks to everyone, and especially the last speaker who integrated a lot of information. I just have two basic questions for clarity purposes. For the 8 psychiatric disorders that you had listed,
Yes.
are those the disorders that research has shown have been identified because others have been excluded, or are those the only ones that we're currently aware of that are largely connected to both maltreatment and have brain differences similar?
Yeah, it's a very astute question. It was based just simply on Eric Vermetten's literature analysis. Eric just reviewed with Doug Bremner everything that had been published on reduced hippocampal volume in psychiatric disorders, and that's what the literature is. Now, the big question is, if there's some other psychiatric disorders that aren't part of that, is it because people have looked and haven't found it, or that they haven't looked? And I can't give you a good answer to that. It would have to go through each one specifically. But the big point is that there may be more, but the fact is that there's this whole range of psychiatric disorders that have the same basic neurobiological finding, and how much is it really due to the psychopathology and how much is it due to maltreatment? And that it's really frustrating, I think, to look at the psychoneuroimaging literature, because no matter what disorder you're looking at, you're pretty much talking about the same brain regions.
I have one other quick clarification question for you that you might be able to also answer. Could you describe what nonverbal emotional abuse is exactly? I couldn't imagine what that was.
Yes. We created this instrument called the MACE, the Maltreatment and Abuse Chronology of Exposure, and it's published this year in PLOS ONE, and it's designed for doing this kind of work on sensitive periods. So it asks questions about 10 types of maltreatment during each year of childhood. And so you get a retrospective guesstimate on what their exposure was for each year. And we started out looking at emotional abuse, and we developed a scale using item response theory, and found out that items that we would consider emotional abuse items were not accounted for by one latent trait. They were 2 latent traits that accounted for emotional abuse items, and it really broke down in terms of those that were verbal forms of emotional abuse and those that were nonverbal. So nonverbal were things like parents not having any time for you, parents showing no interest in you, parents keeping secrets from you, parents expecting you to handle things that were outside your developmental level. And that came out to be nonverbal emotional abuse, and that came out to be extraordinarily powerful for many things.
Thank you very much for all the beautiful presentation this afternoon. So it's very interesting to learn about differences in brain structure and function between maltreated and non-maltreated children. I have a question that is haunting me in many ways and also relates to the areas I'm particularly interested in, which is, do we know, and what kind of work do we need to know, if these differences can be interpreted as causal? So do we know if maltreatment is associated with changes in these structures and function? And what kind of research do you envisage could answer these kind of questions?
The question is a very astute point, which is that a lot of the studies, the vast majority of studies on maltreatment and brain change are cross-sectional. And so we're comparing individuals who had maltreatment to individuals who haven't. We're not looking at this necessarily in a prospective longitudinal way. And so as Michael mentioned, we're lacking in most instances evidence for causality. Now, that being said, there are some emerging longitudinal studies. There are even some large-scale longitudinal studies that have come out that do provide some evidence for causal relationship. There's also other ways of arguing causality statistically, things like finding a dose-response relationship provides some evidence of a cause. Being able to show that you get many quite similar alterations in non-human primates or rodents when you expose them to early life stress. So, for instance, Victor talked about the corpus callosum being reduced. We found the same thing with the corpus callosum. Mara Sanchez found in primates that were raised in a peer-raised versus raised in a semi-naturalistic colony, that there was a marked reduction in corpus callosum. There's some very strong parallels in terms of same brain regions being affected. So there's increasing evidence that would go along with this being cause and effect, but we do need more in the way of prospective longitudinal studies.
Yeah, if I could just, I think that's a great point because in many of these cases, and Mike talked earlier too about prenatal exposures and whether that accounts for some of the relationships we see in terms of brain structure, brain function, and later outcomes. And so I think the animal models are really important here in addition to the longitudinal studies that need to start prenatally, really. But the animal models can really help bolster these findings where you can, in a very controlled way, manipulate early life experiences of, say, rodents, or it's a little more difficult in primates, but at least there are some naturalistic models that you can use. It's going to be hard to go back to the Harlow type of experiments, but there are other more naturalistic models. So I think if we can put all of these types of data together, we can really, hopefully, get a sense as to which of these abnormalities we're seeing are causal or not. It's a great question.
I have a question, since no one's standing up. I have a question for Victor. So Victor, you're a brave man because you're putting alternative treatments on in the conversation. And for some of us out there who think about these kinds of things, we retreat because we have to ultimately compare those treatments to what is considered the gold standard, so TF-CBT and other sorts of evidence-based treatments. And I'm wondering how it is you're so brave, and what do you say when people say to you, what's different about Q-centered therapy? Isn't it just exposure repackaged? How are you going to take, and how hard are you going to work to make that distinction? And what can you tell those of us who are thinking on similar terms, even things like mindfulness and these other promising types of interventions that we might have to go through years and years and years of clinical trials compared to the gold standard to take on? I just wonder how you do it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Thank you. I thought you were referring to the yoga, but you're referring to the psychosocial treatment. Well, the thing is that I never got out to say, this is a completely new intervention. It is a hybrid of interventions like trauma-focused CBT, like exposure, that have already shown efficacy, but I wanted to enhance the role of the kid. I wanted to include some of the realities which sometimes include not being able to have the parents in treatment. Ideally, you have the parents in treatment, but we had been noticing that it was very difficult, that a parent may not, may be okay with a kid having a treatment at the school, but cannot leave work or does not want to participate, right? And which you see in a lot of cases of adversity. So something new was needed. So the reason to develop a new treatment was to target those differences, but also to put out there that it's not necessarily that this treatment is better than others, but that, when Zoloft was developed, they didn't say, well, Prozac is out there, I'm not going to develop Zoloft. And then Paxil did the same. But we know that some individuals respond to Zoloft or Paxil and not to Prozac, right? And when supposedly the mechanism is the same. So we need the same with psychosocial interventions, and to think that one approach will target this very heterogeneous population, it's not right, you know, it's not correct. So I've talked to Judy about it a lot, and we are thinking of doing a trial where we are going to, because the trial that I presented was waitlisted, so the second step that you want to do is compare it to an active treatment, and hopefully an active treatment that's effective like TFCBT. And we hope to do this at a site in Sacramento, California, where we are also doing some imaging, probably FNIRS, before and after the treatment. And the goal is not to say that one is better than the other, but to see which kids are responding to what type of treatment. Yeah. And then the yoga is, I'm in California, so it doesn't take much bravery.
My question in reference to, is there a percentage of, are you utilizing the kids in foster care, adoptive kids? Because to me that makes sense. That's where you've got a lot of these things, the attachments and stuff of that nature. So is there any difference? Where are these children coming for, the numbers, where are they coming from, I guess?
Well, I'm just going to say that it's challenging working with kids in foster care because their caretakers change so much, but you're correct. I mean, there are a population that experience a lot of the traumas that we are talking about, and then on top of that, just the foster care, including the different losses that they have as they go from home to home, but that makes it sometimes difficult to include in studies for that same reason. That has been my experience.
What about adoption? Would that make it easier? Would, they're not going to change.
I really wanted to do a study of children adopted at birth or close to birth who were never with their biological families and compare them, in terms of different ages. But I never got around to designing that study. In our research, we did take kids in foster care. We took kids where we also had access to the biological parent, and we usually interviewed them on different days because it was very disruptive if the parent and the child were having a visit while we were trying to do our research. And we did take kids where Child Protective Service was actively involved in treating the family in some way, or was doing home-based services. We had kids who were with foster parents who were pre-adoptive parents, but we tried to take them as soon after the abuse was reported, but after they went through their legal proceedings. We didn't want to interfere with any legal or forensic proceedings. So it was variable.
I think in terms of a general answer, I just finished sort of reviewing the literature for the entire field. And what's quite striking is that different groups throughout the world utilize different populations. And so like Joan Kaufman will look particularly at kids in foster care. There's a wonderful series of studies looking at Romanian orphans and whether or not they've been adopted. There's, the studies that we've heard, who are looking, these guys from children who are often hospitalized with PTSD. We use for our sample individuals selected from the community, where we're looking at people just out in the community to get a more general sense of the whole range of experiences, not just the more ill. Some individuals have selected only subjects who have no psychopathology whatsoever. And so you have the complete gamut of really severely impaired to highly resilient, and everything in between. And there's an incredible number of commonalities between these studies. So it's really nice to see at this giant range.
Good question, though. One more here? Okay.
So I want to ask, I know that we're having a session tomorrow afternoon about resiliency, but I wanted to, there's the million-dollar question, and what makes some people more resilient to lack of experiences. And I wondered if each of you could just take a minute and say what, based on your research and your knowledge, you would say are kind of the factors that increase resiliency or lead some to be more resilient.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the one factor in the literature that seems to be most prevalent is the presence of an adult that was there to help the child, either supportive or process the event. Of course, but we don't know if it's really the presence of that adult or if there's something in the child that makes them seek that kind of relationship. So at the end, I think it will come down to a mathematical formula that will include many different variables, and the outcome would be resiliency. And that formula actually may be different for different individuals. That's my feel.
Yeah, in terms of, I can't tell you from my research, but I can tell you from our clinical experience that listening to what the child wants tends to help. And I had kids in group homes that were in my studies, and again, we'd interview their moms, and we knew their mom was pretty impaired, but Child Protective Service said they had to go back to their mom. And I had a kid who was captain of the football team, straight A student, who prior to all this was in and out of the hospital and did more bizarre things than you would ever believe. You would not believe, reading the history, this kid was a straight A student in high school and captain of the football team. Well, lo and behold, he did so well in this group home, he went home and he broke down. He wound up doing all those bizarre things all over again, back in the hospital. Now, before he went home, I protested. I said, the kid does not want to go home. He wants to live with his aunt. No, he's not going to live with his aunt. Nobody listened to a kid. Nobody listened to me. So after he went into the hospital, he went to live with his aunt, and he was back doing well again. If they just listened to him in the first place, maybe he wouldn't have been humiliated that much. We've had kids in our study that were in our PTSD resilient group where we saw them for a year. And our first time we tested them, it took 8 sessions. They were so impaired. They were taken out of a foster care environment, put in a pre-adoptive environment, and 6 months later, you would think you were talking to a different child. Child could sit through a 9-to-5 research program. Child was on no medication. The foster parent had no idea what we were talking about and she knew the history, had no idea what we were talking about. I think this is more of an art in some ways. I don't know if we're ever going to have a science to it, but we're going to have a scientist who's really good at describing these type of events that I'm talking about.
I think it's a great question. One thought that comes to mind is I'm not actually sure what resilience is. And I don't know, I've sort of, retracted or, backed off of that term a little bit in terms of thinking about my work and findings. And really maybe we need to think more about adaptation. And so presumably every child, every person has a point up to which they can adapt to a given context. And depending on the amount of stress going on, the amount of social support, huge, one's underlying genetics, all of these factors come into play and help determine just how much can I take, versus when do I reach a tipping point where now it's simply overwhelming and I'm sick with PTSD or depression or something else. But even then, if the right resources are given back to that child, then they can recover. And so that's another form of adaptation. So it seems to me not all is lost, even when some child has developed a mental illness, for example.
I'll toss in my 2 cents there also. It's really complicated. I think that there are